Hello, Carmen, and I'm so excited to have this conversation with you today. I know we had to reschedule, and I just couldn't wait because I've had your book here, being made, being God's image with creation. Why creation still matters. Why can't I talk today? I'm still a little jet lagged. I just got back from London, and I'm like, I don't know, my
That's a
words aren't
very
coming
good
out.
reason.
It is. But as a podcaster, I feel like I should be able to get words out
Mm.
easily. But it's great to have you here. It's great to have
Mm.
somebody on the same time zone here in California. And
Yeah,
yeah, thanks for joining us today.
absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Yes, I'm so excited to have this conversation. We here at the A World of Difference podcast, we love conversations where people can bring their subject matter expertise around our conversation to help us as human beings to
Mm.
flourish.
Mm-hmm.
But we also want to help others to flourish because we know that we have opportunities to either make people's lives better
Mm-hmm.
or be neutral or make them worse,
Mm-hmm.
unfortunately. And so you have this very beautiful concept in your book that you discussed, which for people who identify as Christian, we understand as this theological concept of
Mm-hmm.
Imago Dei, which is,
Mm-hmm.
it's not Hebrew or Greek, right? It's sort of this, I
It's
guess, Latin,
Latin.
right? Yeah.
Why do we
But
use
it means,
Latin? I don't
yeah,
know.
I know. I've asked that too. Why? I guess, I should have learned this in church history
People
and
like people
seminary.
like to sound smart.
Yeah, exactly. It just basically means image of God. So if
Mm-hmm.
anybody out here listening has heard, people who identify as Christians saying, you're a child of God, but also we believe you're made in God's image. So
Mm-hmm.
give us a little deeper understanding of this concept and how it can help us as individuals navigate, our questions of like identity and purpose in our world today.
Okay, you just froze for a minute, and so I think I missed the middle of your question.
Oh, okay. Sure.
Sorry.
Is it better now?
I just plugged in the blue cord, so hopefully, yeah, I think we're good.
Okay, awesome. Yeah. So the question is, how can this concept of the image of
Mm-hmm.
God, being made in God's image as humans, help us have a deeper understanding of who we are as individuals as we
Mm-hmm.
navigate a lot of the questions we have around identity and our
Mm-hmm.
purpose in our world
Mm-hmm.
today?
Yeah, it's a great question, Lori. So I think the foundational concept that is most important to grasp about this is that the Bible teaches that every human being, regardless of religion, regardless of gender, regardless of race, regardless of ability, is the image of God. That is, that we are created by God with a God-given purpose on earth. And so our identity is not something that we self-construct or that we're responsible to come up with ourselves or create ourselves, but that it's given to us by God. And that every human being is inherently valuable and has inherent dignity. And so this is obviously great news for an individual to recognize, like, I'm special. God made me with dignity and worth, and there's nothing I have to do to earn it. I don't have to perform to a certain level to achieve dignity or worth. So that's encouraging on a personal level, but it's also huge in the way we think about other people, and as we think about human community and making sure that others around us are able to flourish. Every human being we encounter is also the image of God, and the idea is that we are like reminders that God is sovereign, that God is creator. And so that when we look at each other, we're supposed to be reminded of the presence of God and the power of God and the goodness of God. God had such good ideas that he made us. and that we are here not just by random chance, but here on purpose to live out our identity as his representatives. So we don't have to go very far to find examples of ways that humans have mistreated each other and
Yeah.
treated each other as having less dignity or worth. Um, all the isms in our world, sexism and racism and ableism and all of that is a result or a product of failing to recognize that every human being is the image of God. So I wrote this book for Christians to help Christians recover, because Christians are the ones who care most about what does the Bible say about this. And yet it has tremendous implications for how Christians look at and treat everybody else on earth.
Yeah. And throughout history and currently,
Mm-hmm.
there have been times, and sometimes, oftentimes, where Christians have not been seen as people who are giving dignity and worth. I just
Yeah.
got back from the UK, and I was in a lot of museums while I was there, because the first
Mm.
weekend, I was there for a week of work, but I spent 2 weekends on both ends with a couple of women that I used to mentor that now live and work in
Mm-hmm.
London. And it was really hot, like record-breaking hot in London, the first Saturday I was there. So we were in the museums because it was air conditioned, and nowhere's air conditioned, not even the tube or the
Good
double-decker
idea.
buses. So, as you walk through, especially some of the art that's, we've seen throughout our lives, and you see depictions of, the Crusades, for example, or you
Mm-hmm.
see
Mm-hmm.
even the famous, the Sistine Chapel. When we think about that, it's God as a
Yeah.
white man depicted. I mean, that's
Yeah.
actually
Yeah.
heretical to say that
Right.
God had, Jesus had a human body, but
Yeah.
to think that God was a white man is also not okay. And that
Right.
gives, it's like it gives a racist and a sexist, like you talked about the isms,
Mm-hmm.
portrayal of who God is, and then who therefore it has a higher status in humanity.
Yeah.
So as somebody who identifies as Christian, how do you sort of explain some of that to maybe some of our listeners who may be
Mm-hmm.
either Muslim or Hindu or Buddhist or atheist? What do you think that would be an approach where we could try to, make some amends or rectify some of that?
Yeah. It's a good question, Lori. I think that what I would want to say to anyone who's listening who doesn't identify as a Christian is, I am so sorry for the ways that people who have called themselves Christians have treated and mistreated other people. Christians have not been kind to Muslims, who've not been kind to people of other ethnicities around the world. Whatever culture the Christians are in. And I think I attribute that to a so I would want to say that we're called to live in alignment with our true identity as God's image, but instead we adopt false narratives about value and worth that are racist and sexist, etc. And so that causes us to look at other people and see them as less than dignified, less than worthy. And so we become suspicious of people who speak a different language or who worship different gods. We become suspicious of anyone whose experiences or whose values are different than our own. And so Christians have, in the name of Christ, often brought harm on those around them because they thought it was their job to somehow force conformity. And yeah, it's really a sad history. There have been lots of wonderful examples too of Christians who've served wholeheartedly and who've loved others and who have, started hospitals and schools and done lots of good things. But you're right, the museums are full of evidence that Christians have not always lived in alignment with what God says is true, not only about us, but about every other human being.
Yeah.
So I would just want to say, I'm so sorry for the ways that if you're listening and you're somebody who feels like you have personally been hurt by Christians or by the church, I'm really sorry that that's happened. And I want you to know that that's not God's heart towards you. And to all the Christians who are listening, I want to say, let's rethink the way we engage with the world, not as our enemy to be vanquished, but as fellow images of God who have this inherent dignity and who are designed to collaborate with us to promote human flourishing.
So well put. Yeah. Thank you for that.
Mm-hmm.
We have in the United States, we're here in California, right? There's a lot of history of this whole manifest destiny.
Yeah.
And as somebody who grew up in the mission world and worked in that world for a while, and I know that you've been a part of that too, a lot of us are sort of, deconstructing a little bit about, or I guess decolonizing a little bit of what that looks like, and having to ask ourselves some hard questions. Like you said, it's always nuanced. There's always a lot of good mixed with some bad.
Yep.
And then the complicity and collusion conversation gets really tricky,
Yeah.
because sometimes it's not obvious to us. There's a lot
Mhm.
of betrayal blindness, or it's just the ocean we swim in.
Yeah.
And I would love for you to kind of, give us your perspective on
Mm.
your book and what you learned, maybe even in your time in the Philippines. I know you talked about
Mm.
getting there, and then as soon as you kind of got through Tagalog language, then it was, well, actually, we're handing all this over to the Filipinos, who are amazing. Filipinos are
Yeah,
some of the best people in the whole wide world. So, of
totally.
course, yeah. So, yeah, walk through some of that with us. Like, where are you at in that conversation? How are you
Mm.
processing some of that?
Yeah, I think one of the really beautiful things about living cross-culturally is that you begin to be able to see your own culture in a new light, and some of the assumptions maybe that you've held about the way the world works become problematized or complicated by when you see kind of how these values land in another place. And so some of our most transformative conversations happened while we were living in the Philippines, conversations with other expats in the Philippines, missionaries from New Zealand and from the UK who saw the United States very differently than we did, and
Yeah.
saw US foreign policy differently than we did, and
Mm-hmm.
just then engaging with Filipinos and seeing what mattered to them. And we can't see the water we're swimming in until we get out of the pool. And so
Yeah.
moving to the Philippines really opened our eyes to um, a bigger, wider world in which God is at work in ways that are not always familiar to us. And I've come to deeply appreciate it. So part of my process as a Christian who wants to grow in my ability to understand and engage well with others has been to read more widely. My education has been solely in Christian schools from preschool all the way on through the PhD. So I went to a Bible college and then seminary and then a Christian grad school. And when I look back over what were the books that I was asked to read, what were the resources that we engaged with, they were predominantly produced in the West by white men of European descent.
Yeah.
I learned so much in my education that I value, and I wouldn't want to go back and erase it. But what I realized moving overseas and then in the years since is that there is a whole wide world out there of really good thinking and
Mm-hmm.
really faithful service happening that I just wasn't exposed to. And so I feel like I'm playing catch up a bit and trying to read more globally and find out what is happening in the global church. What are people saying? What are they seeing? And for me, that journey started in some ways by reading a really tiny book by Justo Gonzalez, who
I love
is
him.
a
Yeah.
really wonderful Latino theologian. He's going to be on our campus at Biola next week. I am so excited. I get to
Wow.
have
Oh
lunch with
my
him
gosh.
and lots
No
of other
way.
faculty. I'm just
That's
thrilled.
amazing.
But I read this little tiny book that he wrote after I finished a PhD. So I already had a PhD in biblical studies, read this little book, and I thought, what could I possibly learn in this little book that I haven't already heard in how many years of higher ed have I had? Like 4 years of Bible college. I spent 5 years in seminary and then 5 years working on a graduate degree, my PhD. And in that little book called Santa Biblia, reading the Bible with Hispanic eyes or through Hispanic eyes,
Mm-hmm.
my mind was absolutely blown. He was revisiting texts, stories that I had heard in scripture over and over again growing up in the church. And yet he was reading them and seeing things that I had completely missed that are right there in the text. He wasn't reading into the Bible, something from outside.
Right.
He was just seeing what was there. And
Mm.
that's when I really recognized in a profound way how much our own social location and our life experiences prepare us to see or not see things that are right in front of us. And so again, not to erase all of the learning that I did in my white Christian context, but to augment it and to add to it with these other voices has become my passion. And so I'm reading as much as I can by Black authors, Latina authors, Asian authors, trying to see what they're seeing and hear what they're hearing. And they're teaching me all kinds of things about the Bible that are new. And so that's been a really rich journey. And I touch on that in the book a little bit
Yeah.
as I talk about God's desire for diversity. and
Mm-hmm.
how diversity is not a bug, but a feature of
Yeah.
creation. And that God's intention is for us to live together in collaborative community with one another. We need each other. We learn from each other. We have different gifts and strengths, and we can celebrate that.
Yes. That's what this podcast is all about. Thank you so much
Mm-hmm.
for that.
Yeah.
It's so true. I feel like I've been on a pretty similar journey over the last many years. Although I did have the privilege of growing up in Latin America and reading, actually, we called our Bible Santa Biblia, Holy Bible. Yeah. And so I grew up reading it in Spanish through a Latin American lens, and a lot of liberation theology that just inherently is embedded in the system growing up there. And understanding that, Jesus does come to set captives free, and the things that he read in the scroll that they wanted to throw him off a cliff for, like those were pretty important for us. And and then I was privileged in even though I went to Southern Baptist Seminary, I went to Golden Gate here in California. We did our 2 semesters of church history. Our textbooks were Justo Gonzalez textbooks, which I only recently found out. I think it was Dr. Beth Allison Barr that did a whole study on the different textbooks used in certain seminaries and how many women were listed in those textbooks, because some of the questioning she gets is, well, why are you putting women back into church history? And she's like, no, I'm not putting them there. They were always there. We're just not telling you about them. But Justo Gonzalez had more out of all the ones we used. Typically his had more. And I vividly remember learning about Perpetua in that class for the first time. And even when I went to Indonesia and spent 10 years there, and in Singapore, I would often bring her up to my Muslim friends, some of them who had converted to Christianity and were being persecuted by their families, but a lot of them were women. And I would often tell them Perpetua's story. And it was Justo Gonzalez that really gave me a love for her, how courageous she was. So yeah, I think that he's not only a wonderful, author and contributor to the church and to seminaries, but I think that Latin American lens for me was so formative. But like you said, I also got to a point where I realized, even in my Southern Baptist Seminary, we did read Justo Gonzalez, but I don't remember a single textbook written by a woman that we used. And other than Justo Gonzalez, I think they were all white men other than him. And
the
so
only one the only one I can remember was Karen Job's Invitation to the Septuagint, which she co-authored with Moises Silva. Of my entire PhD reading list, that was the only book written by a woman.
Wow. Yeah, that's probably pretty sad, because we're
probably
half
300 books on the list.
It's pretty frightening. And it's, of course, it's not just authors, but even when I was in London at one of the museums, the Tate Modern, they had a whole thing of these anonymous women. They're called the Guerrilla Girls. And they have a whole thing about why are women only brought in to, talk about art when they need a diversity token woman, but we're not actually having our arts on display. And obviously there's a lot of issues around that when it comes to, well, we're all bearing God's image, right? And I'm also reading a book right now, Maria Ressa. I'm reading her book, How to Stand Up to a Dictator. She's a Filipina, the first to get a Nobel Peace Prize, I think, from the Philippines. But yeah, her book is so good. She was raised very influenced by her Catholic grandmother growing up. So understanding, this whole concept of being made in God's image and dignity, but it's why she ended up standing up to a dictator and getting persecuted and, imprisoned and all these things that she's walked through. But I think when you understand that God made us equally with dignity, and then you do fight against human rights abuses. So my next question for you is, one of the things I've observed, and I said on this for Justice Revival, and a lot of us have had experiences overseas where we understand human rights abuses, and it's very much a part of the work we were involved in. But in the U.S., one of the things we've observed is a lot of the white evangelicals in the U.S. don't want to talk about human rights abuses here in our nation. We want to point fingers to, places in Africa or the Philippines or wherever, and go be white saviors over there and act like we're fine at home. And when we've got abuse rampant in churches, we've got domestic violence, we've got, so many things. So yeah, what is your perspective on that? Speak maybe to some of the white evangelicals in America that might be listening.
And this is where I really think we need to diversify the voices that we're listening to, because if we only listen to people who look exactly like we do, if we only listen to white men and not women too, and if we don't hear from others, then we aren't going to see the problems in our own context because we'll be immune to them. We're just so used to it. We don't see it. I came across a story in the Bible. I'm an Old Testament professor. That's my job. And so I've read the Bible through many times, and I came across a story in church recently that I didn't remember hearing. And I think it's a really good example of the value that minorities bring to the conversation. It's in Jeremiah chapter 38. And it's the story of, so Jeremiah is a prophet, and he is saying things to his generation that they don't want to hear. The king doesn't want to hear him. He's saying things from like messages from God that people are not excited about because he's telling them things are bad and they're going to get worse. And everybody would rather hear somebody saying, hey, we're on the up and up. This is all going to go great. And, this is going to be an upward trajectory, upward mobility, whatever. And so the king responds to these officials. A bunch of officials get together, and they are like, we should put this guy to death. And so King Zedekiah hands Jeremiah over to them, and they throw him in a cistern, which is like a giant water container underground. And the cistern was empty, but it was muddy at the bottom. And so they threw him into it, and he starts to sink down into his knees in the mud. And then in Jeremiah 38, verse 7, we're told, but Ebed-Melech, a Cushite, an official in the royal palace, heard that they had put Jeremiah into the cistern. And he went to the king in the palace and says, these men have acted wickedly in all they've done to Jeremiah. They've thrown him into a cistern where he will starve to death when there's no longer any bread in the city. This is so interesting because Ebed-Melech, the name Ebed-Melech just means servant of the king, like king's servant. This guy's name is king's servant, which clearly he wasn't born with. This is not his given name because he's from Ethiopia. He's a Cushite, and he's an official. If you read the little footnote, it says, or a eunuch. This is a man who was likely trafficked to Israel. He was made a sexual minority. He was emasculated to be brought into the king's service. So he is a racial minority. He's a sexual minority. His name has even been stripped from him, and he's been given a Hebrew name that is like identifying him as his job, servant of the king. So he's been stripped of his personality and whatever culture he came with. And he's the one who notices the human rights violation. Wow. He's the one who notices what's being done to Jeremiah and says, this isn't right. And he takes a great risk in going to the king and speaking against the other officials who've done this. He has, he doesn't have the kind of power that they have. And yet he's willing to speak up. And the king listens to him and says, okay, let's take him out. So Ebed-Melech goes and he carefully lifts Jeremiah out of the cistern. This is why we need to listen to diverse voices, because Ebed-Melech was in a position to recognize abuse and speak up about it because he himself was a minority. I think this is why Justo Gonzalez's church history includes more women and more global voices, because as a minoritized scholar himself, he's sensitive to this. He notices this. He understands we're not all here at the table. And he's asking, who's not here? Whose perspective are we missing? And so this is one reason I am trying so hard to listen to a broader range of voices, because they are noticing and having the courage to speak out about things that the majority culture is either not seeing, or it would cost them too much to say something.
Yeah, so important. Such an important point. Yeah, I remember when I just made this commitment years ago back in Singapore that I was not going to, continue to read all these white male theologians that I had been kind of never even questioned, right? It was just kind of what everybody did. So I started to really explore like the Mujerista theologians, the Latino women, and then the womanist theologians, the Black women. And it just opened up a whole new world. There's a lot of narrative in the circles I was in, like, oh my goodness, that's a slippery slope. I'm like, to what and why? Why would listening to women, half the world, listening to people of different racial backgrounds made in God's image, be a slippery slope to something bad? In
Yeah.
fact, all it did was open my eyes up to a God who's bigger and better and more beautiful and
Mm.
mysterious and
Hmm.
wonderful than I
Yep.
had been told. And it
Yeah.
has not stopped. Like the curiosity just keeps going. And
Yep.
I saw Hagar in a different way by reading
Hmm.
womanist theologians, you know? I mean,
Yes.
they
Yes.
pointed out all kinds of things about her that no white male pastor in a pulpit had ever said.
Totally, totally. And do I sometimes read things by global scholars that I disagree with and I think actually are not faithful readings of the text? Yes, sometimes what I read from people of color is doesn't align with the way I think scripture is asking to be read. But are there times that I read a white male author and I disagree with his reading of the Bible? Yeah. So, like, we're not going to agree with everything we read. And there's, we have to sift through and sort through everything we read to weigh it and see its value. But I was talking with my students last week about increasing the diversity of voices that we read. And some of them, as I handed out a bunch of books and we started doing a little study project together, we were looking at the Hagar story and we were looking at, a bunch of feminist, womanist, other global scholars and saying, okay, what are they seeing here? And some of my students were like, our other professors warned us about reading these people. They told us we shouldn't be reading this. And like, really? Is this an educational institution or not? We
Right.
read widely, not because we're going to agree with and adopt everything we read, but because we need to become critical thinkers. We need to be exposed to broader ideas. That's part of the recognition that every human being is the image of God and that we're told to collaborate. That's built into the beginning of the story in Genesis 1.
Yes. Yeah, several years ago, I know you're not supposed to have favorite verses, but Genesis 1:27 just became increasingly special to me because
Yeah.
like no matter what people say in this whole complementarian, egalitarian, whatever
Mhm.
debate,
Male
like you just
and female, he
male and
created them.
female. Yeah. Like,
Both the image of God.
do we need any other verse after that? I mean, really, it's
No,
just like
it's
that.
pretty
It's
great.
pretty much that simple, right?
Yep.
And so that's sort of what your book is about. And
Hmm.
yeah, and all it, a lot of ink has been spilled on whether women are able to have equality with men, whether even in
Mm-hmm.
the church and maybe especially in the church these days. And it just seems like, wow, if we could move beyond that and just get to the point of accepting what God made very plain and clear.
Yeah.
So I know that it can be a sensitive topic as a woman in academia, as a woman in Christianity, as a woman who's been in ministry. These are all spaces where patriarchy is the ocean we swim in.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, what do you have to say maybe to that woman who's struggling today?
Mm-hmm. I would encourage her to go back and read Genesis 1 and 2 really carefully, deeply, meditate on it, look at it, notice male and female are the image of God. And right at the beginning, right when God says he created humans as his image, male and female, he created them, then it immediately says what we're supposed to do as the image of God. And it's so that they may rule over creation. Like the image of God is someone who rules over creation. And it doesn't say just the men rule. It says male and female are the image and images rule. And so we are, as a human family, designed for collaboration, designed to side by side partner together in ruling creation on God's behalf. And it's important to add that qualification because this isn't about becoming the king of the castle or becoming the top of the heap. This is not a kind of rulership that climbs on top of other people to subdue them and 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 become somehow better than others. This is a rulership that is collaborative and mutually beneficial. The Bible here at the very beginning is telling us to rule over the animals and over the created world, but not over each other. There's no ruling, there's no hierarchy between humans in Genesis 1 or 2. And so a lot of history, a lot of church history has been spent trying to, I think, use Genesis 3 as a template because Genesis 3 is the story of the fall, the story of
Yeah.
Adam and Eve, the first humans' rebellion against God or their disregard of God's command not to eat from the tree. And when they do that, it results in a hierarchy between them. There becomes the relationship that was designed to be mutual and that is designed to be characterized by teamwork becomes a battle. The man and the woman are battling together. Your desire will be for your husband and he will rule over you. This kind of angst between male and female comes as a result of not obeying God's command, but it was not part of God's design for how humans should be in Genesis 1 and 2. So I would say go back and linger on the original vision for creation and ask yourself, what should we be working toward? What should we be leaning into? Genesis 1 and 2 or Genesis 3?
Yeah. Do we want to live in a fallen world and keep that going? Or do we want to work for God's ideal and what is where humans can flourish together? That's the point that I took away when I kind of dug deeper into that many years ago as well. And once you understand it in that way, it's not only freeing for you as a person, but it allows you to interact with other human beings with love, which was Jesus's, big message, right? To love our neighbor as ourselves, to love God and our neighbor as ourselves.
Totally.
And so it meant we would love ourselves. And if we're women, love yourself, right? We have a hard time with that too, because we've often been told that we're secondary, that we're less than, that we're not the ideal form of humanity. And it's not like we're living in the Middle Ages where they thought we were these uncooked versions of men, but we still have ways where we look at women as secondary.
It is still out there. I just had a comment on my YouTube channel. Somebody watched my video on Genesis 1:26, and his comment was, only men are the image of God.
Oh, weird. What kind of weird cult is he in? Yeah, exactly.
Read your Bible, dude.
Exactly. It's like, okay, strange. Yeah. Anyway, moving on.
It's still being said. It's still being said. Yeah. The microaggressions women deal with when you try to have those conversations in that space. Over the years, I've had to learn there's days I can and there's days I can't. And sometimes there's years and, whatever that I can and years that I can't. And so I thank God for people that, stick in there and keep having those conversations in the places where it's difficult. But yeah, part of it is, to flourish. It also means stepping into this, what God's given us, this good version of ruling, this, like you said, the opportunity to help others flourish as we are also flourishing. Yep. It's a benevolent stewardship. It's maintaining the order of creation and creating space where people have access to what they need to do well. And that's really built into the beginning. Humans and animals share the same food sources, and God gave both of us, human and animal, seed-bearing plants for food. And that implies that we're supposed to share them with each other. And so the stewardship or the rulership is not, let me get whatever I can for myself, but how do I need to order my life and my use of resources so that animals also can flourish, that other humans have access to what they need. And that, that reminds me of what Justo Gonzalez says about the Lord's Prayer when he has a book about the Lord's Prayer called Teach Us to Pray. And on the phrase, give us our daily bread, he points out what is right there. And I had never noticed. It's plural. It's plural. It's not give me my daily bread. It's give us our daily bread. That is, we're praying for the flourishing of those around us. And so if I happen to have more food than what I need, then I need to be part of answering that prayer by sharing it with those who don't have enough food. So it's a communal prayer, and being from a more communal culture helped prepare Dr. Gonzalez to see that in a way that me in my individual cultural upbringing missed. It's right there in the Bible. He didn't make it up.
Yes. So many pronoun things going on with the different lenses, honestly.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Yes. The plural, the singular, the masculine, the feminine. It's just all there, isn't it, in English?
Totally. I told my students just yesterday, there are some deficiencies in English in terms of pronouns. We can't tell if somebody says you, whether it's singular or plural, unless we live in the South. And then you've got the singular, which is y'all, and the plural, which is all y'all.
So true.
He just looked at me like, huh?
What's she talking about?
Apparently nobody here's from North Carolina.
I guess not. Yeah. None of those SoCal people know what you're talking about. One thing I wanted to talk a little bit about, and you talk about this idea of being is just as important as doing in our lives as image
Mm-hmm,
bearers, right?
mm-hmm,
And so, in a world where a lot of us here in the States, and I would say even in Asia, like places like Singapore and Australia as well, are unpacking this mega church uh, wild ride that's been there for some of us. And it's this kind of burnout culture that can be
mm-hmm,
very, I mean, if anybody has seen the Hillsong documentary, they kind of really highlight a lot of that.
mm-hmm,
And having worked on a staff for a year and a half, it's like our bodies get weary because the doing is so intense of
mm-hmm.
building these empires. It feels like that manifest destiny all over again. And um, it's very Western in a lot of ways. And so help us understand the being and the doing aspect in terms of
Yeah,
even thinking about the way of ruling was that we would all flourish and
yeah.
the balance we need for well-being to rest and all that.
Yeah, I am convinced that our work matters. As humans, we're created as God's image, which isn't that the dignity and worth that we have as God's image is not attached to what we do. But it does come with our identity as God's image comes with a vocation that is we're meant to work. Adam and Eve are given work to do in the garden, and work is a good thing. So our work
Mm-hmm.
matters. God actually delegates to us meaningful tasks, but our work does not make us matter. We already have the dignity, we already have the worth. So we're not working in order to gain worth. We're working because our work is an outflow of our true identity, which is full of dignity. So I think this is a struggle for a lot of us, because we work, we produce, we live in a culture where production is so highly valued, and where we try to prove our worth by producing more. And so it's countercultural for us to step back and for us to rest. One of the things that is baked into the rhythm of the Bible and even the creation story in the Bible is 6 days of creative work and 1 day of rest. God rests on the seventh day, and he makes that a paradigm for all of us that we should rest on the seventh day. This is something it's a little puzzling to me. I often talk to Christians who are like, we don't need to keep the Sabbath anymore, right? Like the Sabbath is the name for this day of rest. And they're like, we don't have to do that. That's an Old Testament thing, right? And I'm like, why would you reject the gift of time off? Why would
Yeah.
anyone not be like, yes, thank you, I need a rest? God recognizes that as humans, we have limitations. We are not invincible. We have to step back. Even you and I had this conversation scheduled for several weeks ago, and I ended up sick. And it's really interesting to see what happens in your brain when you get sick, because I'm used to just trying to power through. So I woke up not feeling great on a Thursday morning, but I had to teach several large classes, and it felt really complicated to cancel them. So I just prayed that my voice would hold up, and I tried to keep my distance from people, and I taught on Thursday. I just powered through all day. And Friday morning, which was the day we were supposed to record, Friday morning, I woke up and I was just exhausted, and my throat was worse and I was sicker. And I thought, I just can't do it. I can't
Yeah.
power through today. I actually just have to stay in bed. And what was so fascinating. I had to cancel all these things for that Friday, and the world kept turning. Lori, it did not
Right.
come to a screeching halt because Carmen
Wow.
Imes was in bed. And it's so important for us to know that we are not, like, the world does not revolve around us. It
Yeah.
doesn't come unglued when we have weaknesses or limitations. It's okay for us to have limitations. So the practice of the Sabbath, which Jewish communities still embrace and
Yeah.
practice, and I think more and more Christians are recognizing, okay, I might need this. I might need a rhythm where I rest. It's so life-giving to have a day off where you can recognize the world doesn't depend upon me. It doesn't revolve around me. And if I stop, God will still provide for my needs. It's a recognition that you're not the source of all that's good, but that good things come as a gift from God. And it's been really important in my own spiritual growth and my own just having a sustainable life to have one day a week where I don't do income generating activity. I don't work, I don't grade papers, I don't write books. I just rest. I hang out with my family, maybe watch a movie, read a book, go for a walk, listen to a podcast, like things that are restful to me and life-giving. And I don't know what I would do without it.
Yeah, it can be so hard in the way we live our lives these days.
Mm-hmm.
And yet when we do that, it helps us reject any of that narcissism that's so embedded in American culture that seems increasing in our, version of, evangelical Christianity here in the United States. A lot of even the megachurch movement can be very narcissistic in its nature. Mm-hmm. And so knowing that the world is better in that ruling aspect to help mm-hmm. others flourish, if we're a boss of a company, if we're a pastor, if we're a ministry leader, if we're a parent, when we're busy, the people that report to us, or maybe even our children that are modeling us, they take that on. And so it allows us to work for our flourishing and flourishing of others when we can rest. And it's a hard thing to do, actually.
It is. And this is really when it becomes a command in scripture that you should keep the Sabbath, it really is for the sake of others. You should rest, and your son and your daughter and your male servant and maidservant shall rest, and your ox and your donkey and the foreigner within your gates. Like, everyone in your community gets a day off. It's not ever framed as head of household gets to kick back in his recliner and say, wife, bring me more beer. Like, he can't snap his fingers and keep everybody hopping so that he can have a rest. That's not what Sabbath is. Sabbath is head of household ensuring that everyone else gets to rest. And I think you're right. In the megachurch culture, the news cycle and the promotion cycle and the ministry cycle is so nonstop that we inadvertently create cultures where none of our staff can rest. And that does not produce good fruit. We are not wired to do that. It's unbiblical to live that way.
It's unbiblical. It leads to all kinds of mental health and even physical health, spiritual health as well. And you make decisions you might not ordinarily make in the absence of good rest, and therefore it affects a lot of people. And so this is really helpful and a really good conversation. I really appreciate you sharing all that you shared today. It's been a very enlightening conversation. Thank you once again for writing this book, Being God's Image, Why Creation Still Matters. For all of those listening, go pick it up and read it. It's a very good read. And I think that you'll come away understanding who you are as a person and how you can also work for the flourishing of others. I'm going to have you stick around for our Patreon supporters. So I'm going to ask you a little bit more over there. But thank you so much for your time today, Carmen. It's been just a delight to have this conversation with you.
Yeah. Thanks for having me, Lori. This has been great.